Hi, everyone. This is Tim Hartman. I'm the CEO of GovExec and one of the co-founders of JMU Federal Dukes. I appreciate everybody joining us today for our important session that we have on GovCon 101 with none other than Shea Mundt. We have a really exciting program, but this is just a part of a series of educational events that we have for the community, whether it's students, whether it's your government contractor workforce, people in the government. JMU Federal Dukes tries to serve all the different components of the federal and public sector space with resources that help people connect and do their jobs. And so this is our first effort on trying to give new market entrants some perspective on what the GovCon landscape has in store for it. So I'll introduce our speaker in a moment, but to start, I wanted to give everyone a few housekeeping items. To maximize your event experience, make sure that you are listening on sound with audio on. You may want to put Zoom on full screen mode. The main thing is that we want this to be interactive. Lisa's a great sage of many different facets of this market. And so I encourage you to ask questions and use the chat. You can use the Q&A box through Zoom. And just remember that all attendees can see your questions. So you want to keep them positive and professional to whatever degree you'd like. A little bit about JMU Federal Dukes. So JMU Federal Dukes was founded by a number of people who are active in the federal space who both went to JMU. Some of us had served in government, some of us had served in government contracting industries. And our vision was that we wanted to make sure that we could help connect the university, its faculty, its students, its alumni with the people in the federal government and the agencies in federal government that are doing, the work that changes the world. And we knew all of these different people in the federal space that were doing really important things. And when you talk to them, you'd find out that they went to JMU and there was no real resource for kind of bringing everybody together. I found this vast network of federal influencers, basically, who went to JMU, but none of us knew that anyone went to JMU. And so we created this vision to try to connect JMU, its alumni, its students, with what's happening in the federal space. And our idea is to help become a conduit for opportunities for career development, insights for what's happening in the federal space. And increasingly, we've been helping JMU build its own strategy for how it applies for grants around the federal government, for programs it could develop around the alumni in the federal space and students in the federal space, and help expand services of JMU to the public sector, essentially. And so it's been a really exciting journey. This is a part of our educational mission today. I encourage everybody to sign up for our newsletters and our LinkedIn group if you're not already signed up, but that's a little bit about us. So I've gone through these strategic priorities a little bit. We can advance past that, I think. Our chapter is growing. We're an official chapter of the JMU Alumni Association. Our president is Anne-Marie Johnson. As you can see here, I'm not going to read everybody's name, but there's a diverse group of people from both government and industry and academia who are helping guide and steward the organization. And this has helped us grow to almost thousands of members at this point around the country. Today's speaker, it is my pleasure to welcome Shea Mundt to this webinar. Lisa and I have been friends for many years, and I'm a huge admirer of her. She has a bio here, but I created my own bio, so I'm just going to embarrass her a little bit more. I would say the thing that characterizes Lisa the most in my mind is that she's a dynamic entrepreneur in this space, and she has built with her co-founder, Amber Hart, a really tremendous organization called the Pulse of GovCon that is full of services and insights that help government contractors go to market, whether it's proposal development, whether it's strategy. They do a lot of different support services there. You should definitely check out the Pulse of GovCon's website for some of the membership options they have, but it's just a tremendous resource in this space. I would also say, if you don't know this, Lisa and Amber are real pundits in this space. They really understand the dynamics of how industry interacts with government. And so you'll often see them commenting in news articles for organizations like myself. You will see them testify on the Hill on many different issues. They consult with different companies on their strategy. So it's just really, really a tremendous resource for JMU Federal Dukes and everybody on this webinar to use. She went to JMU. She's a fellow Duke. She's double Duke. She had a degree in SMAD and writing, rhetoric, and technical communication, if that's my memory's right. And so anyway, I think she's a really invaluable person and a great friend of mine. So I will turn it over to you now, Lisa, to educate us on what's happening in the market for people who are trying to get involved in it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tim, for that lovely introduction. Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here. Lisa Shea Mundt, like Tim said, double Duke, love JMU and love supporting this organization. But today we're going to be discussing federal government contracting 101. And the reason that this is important is because I have been in this industry for the past almost 13 years, and so is my business partner. We're the same age, and there was just so many resources that we wish that we had when we had gotten started. For example, I worked at a government contractor as an intern between my bachelor's and my master's. I did proposal management. I had no idea what that meant. I knew the tasks that I had to perform, but I didn't understand the larger interconnectivity of the industry that I was supporting. So before we get into this, who are we? The Pulse of GovCon. We are a technological research and advisory firm that empowers government contractors and drives results through a BD 360 solution. So what that means is that while I have worked at government contractors before, we do not contract with the government. We are service providers to those that do. I always like to put a legal disclaimer in here, since this will be on the internet. Please don't steal our stuff. That's really all this means, and don't resell it. But today we're going to be going over a lot of content. So buckle up, Buttercup, because we got a lot to get through. We're going to be talking about definitions, context, the government contracting process, growth and sustainment practices of those companies. And then what I really like, especially for market entrants or students or anybody that's interested in a career shift, is going through examples of contracting job categories and types. And then same with adjacent job opportunities, because the lens of this presentation is really going to be, how do you enter into this market and in what avenue? Because there are so many different components that support federal contracting. Why is this important? Because there are so many opportunities. I grew up in Northern Virginia, so I've been driving in and around the Beltway my entire life, and I've seen these companies on like names on buildings, and I've driven past and said, I don't even know what they do, but it is plentiful in this area. And the federal government contracting industry really is starved for talent. There's a lot of opportunity. Here are some figures about this is a couple of months ago, but current numbers of the types of jobs that you're able to look for on LinkedIn, Indeed, and Career Builder. But becoming part of this ecosystem can be cumbersome, because a lot of people, when you say government contracting, they equate it to things like IT or healthcare, but it's so vast and there's so many different avenues that it can become really overwhelming. So we're going to start with some definitions and context. We today are going to be talking about federal government contracting as its own industry. And this is the same sort of definition within macroeconomics, which is a branch of the economy that produces a closely related set of raw materials, goods, or services. So when there is things like healthcare, real estate, IT, energy, materials, these are all sort of industries. So we're going to be talking about government contracting as an industry. Now, what does that mean? What do federal government contractors do? And this is something that I wish somebody had told me when I was a student or when I was starting out. The federal government, the agencies that you know about, Department of Energy, Department of State, Health and Human Services, NASA, etc., they buy goods and services from government contractors to keep our country moving. If the government had to do all of the responsibilities that they had by themselves, it would be damn near impossible with the workforce that we have now. So government contractors are essentially companies that these needs get outsourced to. When I had started, I called us sort of like glorified middlemen, because it was us really performing for our customers, the federal government. And this is for anything from administrative assistants to nuclear scientists, from pens to warships. The government buys literally anything and everything under the sun. So it's not just information technology. It's not, government contracting is IT. I've worked with customers that work with the government to provide things like uniforms, janitorial services, construction is a big one. What I'm getting at is if there's an interest that you have, it is likely that the government purchases that from contractors. And it's because, again, they have a lot of things that they need, and so they need a lot of help. And so it's really for us to support their missions. Now, I can give sort of an abbreviated history of government contracting, but it's not a new industry. It's been around since the Revolutionary War, and it's expanded into a $4 trillion industry today. Now, that number has a big caveat to it, and we're going to be talking about that in a little bit. Things have sort of shifted since the 1960s with things like research and development. And then the 80s is really when contractors started providing complex services to the federal government. And this is sort of like how people perform work with product support, people performing work versus products. This is like value-added resellers, et cetera. Now, currently, and this was, again, a couple months ago, there was 580,000 active federal government contractors that are registered to do work with the federal government. And this can be found on sam.gov. Not all of them are, highly successful. Not all of them even have contracts with the government, but just to show you that there's a lot of opportunity out there beyond the big businesses that you might see, especially if you're driving around this area. We've put some of the logos over here on the side, and some of them are sort of straight government contractors, and others you might look at and say, well, Lisa, I know Google and Microsoft and AWS, and I've never considered them government contractors before. That's because a lot of these commercial firms even will have arms of their company that are dedicated to working with the federal government. So even if you're not necessarily going to work with a company that only contracts with the government, if you work for a commercial firm, there's still a possibility for you to do government contracting work within that larger organization. Now, the number of distinct federal contract actions, so these are anytime the government awards somebody a contract, has gone from 400,000 to over 1.4 million in the last decade. So this is contract to award after contract after contract after contract. It is just such a massive industry. And we're going to talk about what contracts mean in a couple slides. So we're going to talk a little bit about the government contracting process, because it is a process, and there's sort of two different life cycles that operate in order for companies to be successful and for the government to get what they want. The federal government has an acquisition life cycle that they process, or that they go through. It starts with a mission requirement. They plan, develop, execute. The mission has results, and they do it again. Now, industry has their own life cycle on how to win those contracts. But I wanted to start with this just to say that there is a pretty large disconnect versus working within the federal government proper and versus working within industry, so to speak. We're all supporting the same mission, but our processes and methodologies vary pretty widely. Now, I mentioned before, this is a $4 trillion industry, and that's a big number, obviously, but that doesn't mean that there's $4 trillion for government contractors to play with. The way that this is broken down is based on Congress's priorities, and it dictates how agencies spend their money each year. Now, you can see here, if you have a total of $4 trillion over the course of the year, 62% of that goes to mandatory spending, and then it's broken down into discretionary spending and interest payment on the national debt. And then even from that 30% of the discretionary spending, it's broken down further by what sort of sectors receive the money. Things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security are in that discretionary spending. And so you're really left with a small portion. Now, it's still a large industry, but there's just so much rhetoric on how big the industry is that sort of overinflates the amount of opportunity for contractors. But there's still a ton of opportunity. There's, and we have some stuff here that I'm not going to dive too deeply into, but just really all about congressional budgetary acts and the process and how it changes, year over year. But the essentially the government and industry operate on fiscal years that run from the first day of October to the last day of September. So it's not the calendar year. So when we're talking about fiscal years, they're different months, as you can see down here, each quarter as well. We're in an interesting area right now where we're about to move into the fourth quarter, and there's a lot of rhetoric about fourth quarter spending sprees, but that's a soapbox that I'm not going to get on right now. But the moral of the story is that there is process, there's best practice, and there are very regimented components of how and when this big line item bucket of money gets spent. The people that spend the money on the federal side fall really into the procurers and buyers. So, and this is important in case you ever want to go into the government too. There are people that are in charge of putting together these contracts for federal government contractors to then bid on. This would be more if you were already in industry and you were curious about who you wanted to connect to. But we have sort of everyone from those procurers and buyers to the influencers, program managers on the federal side, high-level decision makers, and then the end users, any staff that might use what is being procured in a contract. And what do they buy? I alluded to this before, but it's everything. Primarily, federal buyers purchase aircraft materials, combat ships, missiles, professional services, drugs and biologicals, healthcare, IT, telecommunications. Those are sort of the top line items that get spent year over year. And in FY22, the federal government spent more than $678 billion on contracts. So I'd mentioned it's not $4 trillion, but $678 billion is still a really significant pool of money. And that is important because the way that government contracting firms exist is through growth and sustainment process. So it's a little different. We have a different sort of mindset of the market because in order for companies to sustain themselves, they need to constantly be going through a bid process to bid on a contract, get on a contract, execute the contract, and then do it all over again. But what's a contract? In this case, it's the same thing as you would normally think a contract is, right? It's a mutually binding legal relationship. And in this case, it obligates the seller to furnish the supplies or services and for the buyer to pay for them. So you would go under contract with HHS to purchase professional services or PPE, especially during the COVID times, right? Like if you had masks, this would become a contract. It'd be legally binding. They would pay, you would provide. Now, these contracts in terms of federal government contracting are typically issued for bid through something called a solicitation. They will solicit industry to present options of why you should be the one that they choose. These quite often contain things like requirements and shall statements, things that you must agree to and must respond to in order to acquire the contract or capture the contract. These are other terms that we use. These solicitations are organized based on the Federal Acquisition Regulation and or the DFARS. So this is sort of the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation supplement if you're working with defense or civilian. Typically, people will sort of segment these two sectors out when they are federal government contractors because there's just really different processes by which to interact with both. Defense, obviously, there's a lot more in terms of like clearance requirements and other sort of sneaky squirrel stuff. There are three basic types of contracts that you might find: firm fixed price, cost plus, and time and materials. That's really what it comes down to when you start pricing things out. So we're not going to get into the minutia of that today. But how do we get a contract? Let's say I'm a federal contractor and I know I want to do business with the government and I know that I have a customer base. And now I've even seen a need. I've seen a solicitation come out. How do I acquire it? You do that typically through using proposals and proposal responses. When I had first started and I was a proposal coordinator intern, I heard proposals and I thought about people getting down on one knee and holding out an engagement ring. It's sort of like that in a business sense, right? That's a little tongue in cheek of saying you're trying to convince somebody to commit to you. And in this case, you're trying to convince the government to commit to your company. It's typically a written document to win a contract or a seat on a contract. And it's really trying to convince them to commit to your company for a contractual period of performance. Now, the other thing to know about government contracting, if you're going to get into this field, is that nothing is forever. These contracts all have set periods of performance for them to begin, end, and then potentially begin again in this wonderful circle of life. So it can be a volatile industry as well, because things can change really quickly and on a dime. Now, you also have to find these contracts. Companies don't necessarily get handed these contracts. Sometimes they do. We could get into sole sources and everything like that if we had more time. But typically, these companies will have opportunity pipelines that is a list of potential contract opportunities that are specific to your company. And the government communicates these contract needs through a variety of channels. Well, Lisa, it's the United States federal government. Isn't there one source to find all government contract opportunities? No, there's not. There's not. And that's a soapbox. But there's a lot of different channels that the government will use to communicate their needs to industry. These are things like sam.gov I had mentioned before. If you're interested in getting into this market, that is sort of like supposed to be the one-stop shop for federal contracting initiatives, things like, what are they trying to say? Like company information for contractors, et cetera. But they also can communicate these needs through industry days, through trade conferences, social media, something called procurement forecasts, acquisition dashboards, and vendor repositories. We've clocked it at the Pulse at over 90 .gov sources of federal contract information that you can use as market intelligence in order to identify contracts for competition. Now, what you're going to hear if you want to get into government contracting is that really the data is important, but it's all about building relationships. And it's hard to blame the government for that, right? We want to work with people that we know, people that we like. So if you're a people person and you want to connect with new folks, if you want to sell sort of your wares, I think that government contracting is a really good opportunity for you, because really it is about who you know, who you're connected to, and you can be the greatest, offerer for a specific component of contracting. But if you're an unknown, then nothing's going to really come out of that. And we're going to talk about that and the types of job employment opportunities a little bit later. But this sort of goes into, communications and marketing plans. There's a whole ecosystem that is dedicated to winning and then executing these contracts. So I mentioned bidding on contracts. They do this through a proposal response process. And again, if you become an expert in proposals, then you'll know how to follow this. The RFP is released, you plan for the proposal, you actually create the proposal, you submit it, and then it gets awarded, or you lose and you do a debrief and then you start the whole thing over. The whole life cycle of these sort of the proposal life cycle is extremely detailed, extremely in-depth, and there's whole job and career paths dedicated to just knowing how to do this. And now once you actually win a contract, you're a federal contractor, you win a contract, you actually have to perform on it too. That's something that especially, people in my field of more of the BD and growth side, they're like, oh yeah, I forgot about the actual program that you have to then perform on, and you have to do it well. And you get evaluated on how well your organization works on these contracts. It gets put away in the reported in the CPARs, the Contractor Performance Assessment Reporting System. You get ratings. You have things like past performance questionnaires that get sent to your customers to evaluate you, which then impact your ability to get new contracts. It's fascinating. And then, of course, if you are like going after the same work that you were performing on, you become the incumbent, and that can be both a pro and a con. But the idea here is really there's just so many different elements to even obtain the contracts by which a government contractor can continue to exist. And that's why it's really important, even if this is not really the realm of government contracting that you want to enter. So let's talk about those entry points, because there is such a variety. So we're going to go over types of government contracting job categories and types, and maybe what kind of person you are, what your interests are, and how you can still work in federal contracting. So everything that I've mentioned before has been sort of the growth and strategy positions, right? And I think that that's a good place to start because it's so important to just the continued operation of a company. This is one of the only examples of a type of company where if you don't go through this process, that is, repeatable, that where you are compliant, where you are convincing people to buy into you, then your company will simply cease to exist. And it's not just about how good of a salesperson you are either. There are so many, I mentioned the FAR, there's regulations that you have to follow. There's something called compliance with your federal proposal, where if you don't, down to how big your font size is, follow instructions, then you will be thrown out and you can't even be in competition for that contract anymore. So if you are a stickler for the rules, if you like to write, if you like to sell, if you like high stakes, if you like a little bit of a gamble, then growth and strategy positions might be for you. This is really about things like developing the business. We talk about capture managers. We talk about proposal managers, sales, account managers, business and competitive intelligence analysts. So ways that you can enter this, because I'm sort of started at the manager level, is anything that says like proposal analyst, BD analyst. That's a really good sort of language for you to look into if you are a true market entrant and you're trying to get into the field. Then there's sort of the program and project personnel positions. It's starting at the top with the program or project manager. Now, I'm saying two different terms here because depending on your contract, you either have a larger program or a smaller project within that. Now, this is just all about if you like herding cats, if you are all about the organization, if you want to understand things like contract burn rate, if you want to talk about management methodologies, project scope, life cycle, budgeting, schedule, risk, from everything from the beginning of a project to the closeout of a project, then program and project management positions might be for you. One of the main criteria for this is to obtain a PMP, which is a certification in project management. So especially if this is something that you're interested in, please look into that. And then, of course, you need more than that for a project or a program to continue to operate. You typically have the manager at the top, but then you need other folks to work on the contract. This is another hot tip. If you are looking at jobs and you're seeing what's out there and you notice contract, or there's a job posting that says something like contingent on contract award, you need to start looking for language on whether or not it's an internal position or a contract position. So by that, I mean, some of these large federal contractors especially will have job postings that say, you're an analyst somewhere. But if you read deeper, then you realize that you're an analyst on a project, which for, lack of better terms is typically something that's more short term. And some people like that. They get on a project or a program and maybe the contractor continues to win, or they get acquired by the new contractor. When they win, they get brought on too. But there is a lot of volatility there. It's not as stable as working internally. So, but if you're someone that's like, oh, I don't know if I want to be in this for 20 years or 2 years or 5 years, then it's really going to change your frame of reference on what type of employment you want to do. But we need people to work these contracts. And so that can be literally anything though. Like you can be a coordinator on the project. You can work the actual technical components of the project, budget analysts. There's so many different realms for actually working on the contracts. Now, when it comes to more of those internal to a company position, there's also things like human capital and human resource positions. This is great. So, and what you're going to start seeing is I'm not just talking about growth. I'm not just talking about, being a specialist in IT or, financial controls or construction or anything like that. These companies need a larger skill set to just continue the operation of the firm. So HR is great. Recruiting is another great way to get into a federal government contractor, because they need somebody that can staff these projects, and you need to find these people, you need to bring them in, you need to vet them, interview them. So I know a lot of people, when they start in industry, will start as recruiters, because it's something that you don't necessarily need a degree in. You can have a bunch of variety in your background. But if you like to talk to people, if you're good at finding people and vetting them, then that's a really good opportunity for you. I also love telling marketing people, creative, visual, aesthetic people, to look into government contracting too. If you develop graphics, if you know how to use Illustrator, InDesign, Photoshop, then this is still a really good industry for you to get in, because there's internal marketing efforts. And then there's also like proposal marketing. There's people, there's full jobs where people at large companies develop the graphics that go into the proposals. People don't think about this, right? Or a lot of large firms too, in order to increase their market outreach, need full marketing and communications plans. So you can have public relation managers, you can do social media managers for these companies too. Things have really shifted. But I mentioned before that in order to really develop relationships and for people to know about you, you have to tell them. And so this idea of like large scale marketing is also something that's really cool, and something that I really like. It goes into a little bit of the sales and growth as well, but you have a much more creative sort of purview. Finance and performance positions. So fun fact, I met my husband at JMU. We were sophomores. He was in the College of Business, and he got his undergrad and his master's in accounting. And he went and worked at a Big Four kind of company, did the public tax accounting work for a long time, said he didn't want to do that anymore. We live in Northern Virginia. He said, I wonder if I could move my understanding and my schooling into a federal contractor. And sure enough, yeah, if you're good with numbers, then we need you here too. It's not, again, necessarily just about the subject matter of the contracts, but just what contractors need in order to operate. So FP&A is a huge component. This is, supporting an organization's financial health, planning, budgeting, integrated financial planning, management, and performance reporting, forecasting, modeling, all things that are needed. Things like budget analysts, business operation managers, tax managers. I mentioned proposals. I talked about what a crazy large integrated system it is. There are positions specifically designed to help with the pricing component of proposals. So doing like pricing analysis, price to win analysis, cost analysis. Those are all components that if you're good with numbers and you can translate that into the contracting space, then there is a lot of opportunity here. I also have executive management and operations, because obviously there are people that are leading this company. Do you want to be an entrepreneur? Do you want to lead your own firm? You want to be your own boss? You could be your own government contractor. Or you can work at a high level within any of these if you want to sort of climb up the ladder. There's a lot of opportunity for career growth. So this is just some of those options here. But, a lot of companies in government contracting are small businesses. It's not just the, Booz Allens or the CACIs or the Raytheons and Lockheeds of the world, right? There's definitely lower thresholds for some of the firms to work with the government. And so I've worked with companies that are solopreneur type of government contractors, where they're a company and they bill themselves on a project, and that sustained them for a time. And now they have like 40 employees. It's a great growth strategy. And it's a very lucrative market to be in. So if you're like, I know I want to own my own business, but I don't really know in what, and then you think about what that thing is that you're passionate about or that you know about, you could probably create a government contractor for that business. We also need legal people in the industry. Legal is very important, because what word have I been saying this whole time? Contract. Contracts by definition are legal. And so we need people that understand the legality of those contracts. We also need people to manage the contracts. So there's the sort of attorney side and general counsel, and then there's the people that can manage just the contracts as they come in. So that there's also a whole component of these proposals. Remember, I talked about proposals a lot, right? It's a very big part of government contracting, but there's also something that happens where if you lose an opportunity through a proposal, you have the opportunity to protest it, which essentially means, I'm not going to say sue, but take take legal action against the federal government because you lost. And there are attorneys that specialize in these protests. So I've met a lot of people. We've worked with the George Washington University because they have a whole sort of component of their legal program that are dedicated to contract law. And a lot of them are interested in the government side of the house and the federal contracting. They say, oh, maybe I'll be internal legal counsel to general counsel to these government contractors. There's a lot of opportunity there. We need people to actually understand the federal acquisition regulation that I talked about, the FAR. And it's not to say that every per day person couldn't understand it, but it is in legalese. And so it does help to have that sort of specialty on your staff. Security is also big. This is things like I mentioned before, working with the Department of Defense requires things like clearances, which could also mean that to even work on a project or a proposal for a project that has a clearance requirement for it, you need to be in a SCIF, or you need your facility to have a full security clearance, like a facility security clearance. So you have people that work in these organizations like facility security officers, who is their responsibility to make sure that everything maintains that security. Information system security officers too, everything, moving into a virtual environment through COVID definitely threw a lot of contractors for a loop when we were so used to the in-person grind. And so making sure that we have cybersecurity all together, and that things like IT and phishing attempts are, closed down in advance, especially when we work with such sensitive information. So if you're interested in IT security or physical security, even you could move into the government contracting space. And then procurement. There's sort of two levels of procurement here. There's internal, which sources goods and services from within for the organization, and then federal procurement, which sources goods and services for the federal government. But you could do this for things like logistics, supply chain, asset and supply managers and coordinators, acquisition analysts too. So having people that are actually responsible for procurement too. I know some of these larger companies, especially for internal procurement, when you need to do things like get materials and products for your workers, this is all a different component of a much larger industry. So I've gotten through the sort of high level government contracting jobs that you can see. That is not exhaustive. There are so many other different ways that you could enter this market. It's just to show that if you did work for a government contractor, you don't need a specialty in government contracting as an industry, and you can use your own skill set, your own ability, and your own interests in order to, provide value to these federal contractors. But it's not just contracting, right? It's a much larger industry than even that. And so there's sort of these adjacent job opportunities too, if any of this has sounded interesting to you. Obviously, I couldn't finish this presentation without mentioning working for the federal government. It's not government contracting as an industry, it's the customer to government contracting. But definitely federal positions are a great opportunity for people, especially, I'm sure you've all heard of stuff happening with the workforce as they start to retire. There hasn't been a lot of young blood going back into the government. And so that will eventually become a problem. So if you're interested in sort of the government lifestyle, that's obviously ways that you can move to. And there's a lot of hiring paths for the government, things like veterans, military spouses, families of overseas employees. There's a lot to look into. And if you are interested, please look at usajobs.gov. Now, I will say we could do a whole presentation on usajobs.gov. There's a lot to consider, and there's a lot of differences in applying to federal positions than there are to industry. So if that was something that you were interested in, I would do your due diligence before applying to those sort of jobs. Academic positions. There's a woeful lack of things like academic journal articles on this industry. It's not to say that they're not there. Fun fact, I just started working on my PhD in writing and rhetoric from Mason. Sorry, I'm in Northern Virginia. And I want to connect my readings to my professional identity and my love, which is federal government contracting. So I'm looking, I'm on JSTOR. I'm looking for these sort of types of academic research articles, and there's not a lot, but there are some. And it is starting to sort of take shape where academics are looking more at this industry because it's so large. I mentioned before, $678 billion spent on it a year. How could we not take a deeper dive and look into that type of industry? So there's a lot of job verticals here. I know, like at Mason, since we are up in the Northern Virginia area, they've opened a government contracting sort of school, and there's things like research fellows all across the United States, right? Graduate research assistants, affiliate faculty, administrative associates. There's ways for you to work in academia, but still support government contracting. This is one that I didn't really think about when I started in industry. I got my major, my undergrad and my master's in writing, rhetoric, and technical communication, and also SMAD for my undergrad. And part of SMAD, which is the School of Media Arts and Design, was journalism. And I took a couple of journalism classes, and I was like, meh, the timeline thing wasn't for me. But if it is for you, then we need journalists in this realm to write about the things that we see and we do. And, you know, Tim at GovExec, that's one of the things that they really present and promote. And a lot of their components of the company support that. But there's so many different types of sort of publications that focus on government contractors themselves and the people that run them, but then also the federal government and also the programs and the initiatives and the regulation changes and everything else that goes into this, because people need to know. So you can be a reporter, an editor, a content marketer, audience marketing. Like there's just, again, those sort of firms have GovCon adjacent opportunity. And then there's also trade industry positions. There are so many different trade groups that support industry as well. And they work with things like policy and government relations and media relations, and they need operations and event coordination. They need things like I said, marketing and communications with industry that they're constantly reaching out to. And so I've just put a couple of those options there. So the takeaway, and I'm coming right up against it, but the takeaway is that we need you in this industry. And there is such a wealth of opportunity that I wish when I was a student, I had known about, because people always ask, well, what do you want to do? Where do you want to be? And I didn't have a good answer for that. And now when I get asked this question, I always say, well, what industry do you want to work in? Let's start there. Let's have that be the front of funnel. Do you want to work in fashion? Do you want to work in healthcare? Do you want to work in law? Do you want to work here? Like, you can always start sort of at that macro and then decide based on your interests and your skill set how you can support that industry better. So really, it is a fascinating, interconnected industry, and it's so much more than what you see in and around the Beltway. There are a lot of options for market entrants, so don't let anybody tell you that there's just one path to do federal government contracting. Thanks so much. We have a couple of slides here because we really want you guys as Federal Dukes to continue to follow along with our mission, stay up to date on events, programming, professional development opportunities. So if you're not following us on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, get there. I am the communications chair for this, so I'm a little biased, but interact with the material because I think that it just makes it so much more important if we are all communicating and connecting. So also you can connect with us via email and on LinkedIn, on the group, and really anywhere that you can find us digitally, you can connect. So the work continues. Any questions? And Tim, you want to come on and talk too?
We haven't gotten any questions as of yet, Lisa, but my main question is in terms of if there's students that watch this or people who are looking to get into it from a career perspective versus like a company perspective, what advice do you have for them to try to get their foot in the door?
Yeah, I think it's really just, again, it's starting with what's your skill set? How can you support? And then you really have to identify what the position titles are for how that support can be given to an organization. So, and I start with the word analyst because I didn't really know what that meant, but it was sort of like a catch-all for entry-level positions. So I think that that's a good one to look at. It's seeing what's out there of like what's publicly available in terms of open job recs, and then saying like, oh yeah, I could probably support that. Starting that, obviously interning, if you can, I think is one of the best ways to get your foot in the door, because then you sort of get trained on the go. That's what I did. I was an intern. I knew nothing about federal contracting or proposals. All I knew is that proposals were written and I could write. That's something that I also like to talk about, just because I am so into the technical communication side of the house, that work on your writing, because no matter what element of these you contribute to in the workforce, you're gonna have to know how to communicate via written word.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the other question I would have is just from your perspective at the Pulse, and I could answer this from GovExec too, just what industries do you see trending? Like what kinds of companies do you see starting to enter the market and sort of maybe investing in the market now?
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I mean, if you had asked me that a couple of years ago, obviously health and human services, like putting out all healthcare. And it still is one of the top line items of things that are purchased. I mean, on the sort of services side, obviously there's things like PPE on the product side as well. It's a little skewed because when it comes to the dollars, it is mostly spent on things like ships and planes, because those things are just by nature more expensive. But I mean, IT still has a really big sort of foothold in here. Organizational management has been big, sort of organizational transformation, because there is so much on that needs to be shifted culturally within the government that they need help to just sort of wipe the slate clean and do things more efficiently and effectively. So I've been seeing a lot more of that pop up. What about yourself?
Yeah, I think there's always consulting firms that are hiring in this space, and I think you're right. Like the digital transformation is they're looking for talent all the time that are sort of plugged into digital trends, which a lot of college graduates, new college graduates in particular, or recent college graduates are very plugged into intuitively and can represent themselves very strongly, I think, on that front. And then all the technical fields are just, in such demand right now, whether you're a developer or an engineer or project management, there's just so many companies that are looking for that kind of talent right now. We do have a question from, this one comes from Anne-Marie from Spokane. How do the values of JMU epitomized in the quote, Dukes hold doors, align with the federal government market? So how do those values, from your perspective, Lisa, align with some of the stuff that happens in the federal space?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that goes back to the fact that this industry is built on relationships, and nobody's going to want to work with you if you slam the door in their face. We have to be, there's kindness, and there's also understanding of, the whole idea of JMU Dukes holding the door open became something that nobody said like this is a mandate or this is a requirement, right? But it was, we all, once you learned about it too, you wanted to contribute to it. And I think that's the sort of contribution to the larger mission that really rings true in federal government contracting.
I think the other thing that sort of pervades this connection that JMU has, because Federal Dukes is just kind of tapping into this existing connection that already was there, because so many JMU graduates were serving in the public sector in some way, whether it's the industry supporting public sector or the public sector itself. And I think that JMU is a very sort of socially active and socially conscious campus. there's a lot of volunteerism built into the culture at JMU. There's a lot of, the holding doors concept of just giving back. And I think that public service draws just a disproportionate amount of JMU grads into that compared to other industries that might be available or particularly available in Virginia. So I think that's another thing is like when you're serving in one of these in the government industry in some way, shape, or form, you're supporting the United States, you're supporting making the world a better place. You can find your piece of making the world better, whether it's through the military or the EPA or the IRS or FEMA, like all the examples that we hear in the membership. It's a draw for people like JMU students who are kind of like looking to change the world as kind of part of the JMU DNA.
Yeah,
So
when I got started, people asked what I liked about government contracting, and I mean, at 24, I said I like competition, high stakes in America. It's like because it was you realize, this is taxpayer dollars that are being leveraged, and so being good stewards of that, I think, is very important.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. Like today, I had a lunch with a company that is really thinking about space and the United States' role in space. And we're just, coming up with different ideas for stuff that their company could do in that. And I was like, if I were 8 years old and you told me that I'd be at a lunch brainstorming like cool space widgets, like I never would have believed you. So it's an interesting space. It's a technical space. It can be, your proposal examples, like those are no joke in terms of how technical the writing and the clarity has to be. But it also is much bigger than us.
Yeah.
So Lisa, I think this has been great. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap?
I would guess my final thought would just be, again, one of the things that I think is important for this is my degree is in the humanities, right? I was not College of Business. And you think about some of these government contractors and you might think big business, you might think MBA kind of people, you might think really that sort of mindset, but it doesn't have to be. So you can work within government contracting no matter what your interests or major is. And so I would just encourage folks, since it is it's a steady industry in the sense that the government is always going to have requirements, but it's also constantly changing. So it has that level of excitement too.
And I totally forgot to mention in my bio that what was your title at WXJM? You were the general manager of XJM at one point, right?
I was one of the managers. I don't even remember which manager, but I was at WXJM and I was I was a jazz DJ. So you're listening with me, Lisa B, bringing you smooth jazz to bring you through lunch. My friends called me DJ Shea a lot. That was not my name.
Yeah. So any background that you have at JMU can be applied to the government space. Even if you're a hip XJM DJ, we have a place for you.
The hippest.
All right. Well, thanks, Lisa. And everyone else that's still here, please feel free to post this as we post it, to share it with friends and colleagues and children if they're interested in this field. So thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.